Well, without any further ado, though, I'd like to introduce Larry Campbell talking about the history of railroads in Muncie and Delaware County. Larry?
Thank you, John. Pardon me tonight if you see me blinking around a little bit. I just had some cataract surgery and 2 spatial lenses put in my eye about 2 weeks ago, so you may see me blinking quite a bit here tonight. That's the reason. I am a native Munsonian, lived here all my life, was born here. Lived 5 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is another great railroad town. And when you look at this picture up here, you might think I'm going to be talking about toys. Well, I'm not going to be talking about toys. This is a toy interurban. And most people ask me, how did you get interested in railroads? Well, this was one of my first toys right here. My grandfather bought it for me. I never had anybody in my immediate family that worked for the railroad or around the railroad, and except my father had a brother-in-law who came here from East St. Louis right after World War I, which he had been in. Work was hard, and he came here during the Depression, and he was a hobo. So that's on the opposite side of the railroad. I also had a great uncle who was the general machine shop foreman at the Nickel Plate Railroad here in town, and Frankfort, Indiana, and Delphus, Ohio. So there was some connection. But this was my first toy that I ever had. And so that sort of stemmed an interest in it. And one of the unique things, my mother kept all my toys. I was an only child. The number on that interurban is 622. 622. That happens to be my birth. 622, June 22nd. I won't tell you what year. Another interest, my grandparents lived about 3 or 4 houses from the new post office on Memorial Drive. South of that new post office, if you look at that picture right behind, that's me. Right behind me down toward the bottom is you can see one of the rails of a railroad. That happens to be the Central Indiana Railroad, later taken over by the New York Central, and they utilized a roundhouse at 17th and Garkey. Right the other side where you see the boxcar is the Norfolk Southern, the Newcastle line, which runs south. Between those 2 tracks, and about where I'm standing, was an area called Sandy Banks. For those of you that are from the south part of Muncie, that's called Sandy Banks, and there was a hobo village there. And unlike today, kids could go down there and you could even talk to the hobos without fear of any problems down there. And that's what I did, and many times my grandparents would come after me, and I would come home on the end of a Apple switch or something else for being down there. Another thing that stirred an interest, in I believe 1942-43 time frame in Albany, Indiana, there was a head-on crash of 2 locomotives. A Berkshire locomotive, it's a 284 steam locomotive, and I believe a consolidation, a 280 locomotive. I believe 1 person was killed, possibly 2, in this head-on collision. Well, my father took me out to see this. Here's a guy about 7 years old, and you know what 7-year-olds are looking for. Well, about 2 cars back of the engine in this picture right here was a gondola car full of little teeny metal discs. They used them in earphones in the Second World War. That's what vibrated and you could hear out of the earphones. Well, you know what 7-year-old kids were doing? All the other 7-year-old kids were doing the same. We were seeing how many of those discs we could pick up and take home with us instead of looking at this wreck. But this is a picture from a Nickel Plate magazine. It's the only one I had. My father had taken a couple pictures, but I had lost them in the years. Then in about 1950 or 51, the Indianapolis Union Terminal had a 2080 switchers. It was here in town with the New York Central. They were housed at the roundhouse of the Central Indiana at 17th and Garkey. They backed down the Central Indiana tracks all the way up around by Kirby Wood Lumber and onto the Big 4 up between Council and Liberty Street. Well, it so happened that sophomore in high school, myself, would jump on that right running board on the front and ride that train to school. So I rode that train to school my sophomore year and part of my junior year in high school. There was 2 of us that rode that. Something we shouldn't have done. We were admonished not to do that by the railroad people, but after about the 4th or 5th time, they quit shouting at us, and it was pretty warm in the winter with all that steam coming off of it too. So we did that. Let's talk about the railroads of Muncie, Indiana. There were probably more railroads here than a lot of people realize. Of course, to start with, we had the Citizen Street Railway, which was a street railway within the town itself, Muncie. Later taken over, and they ran the street railway as well as expanded into the surrounding areas, the Union Traction Company. And later that was taken over by the Indiana Railroad. We had the Chicago, Indiana Eastern, became the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis, and then the Pennsylvania Railroad. A lot of people don't know that Pennsylvania came into Muncie. It came in from Anderson on the Big Four tracks. There was a crossover at Lincoln Street on the east side of town, and then it went north out of Muncie, up through Anthony, Stockport, Wheeling, Matthews, Concourse, up that way. It was a Pennsylvania, later was taken over by the New York Central. Fort Wayne, Cincinnati, Louisville became the Lake Erie and Western, Nickel Plate, then the Norfolk Western, and today we know it as the Norfolk Southern. And there were two of the Lake Erie and Westerns that came into town. There was the Fort Wayne, Cincinnati, Louisville, which came down from Fort Wayne, went on down south, Newcastle, and on down to Cincinnati. Later on, in the next line, you can see it was the Indianapolis-Sandusky, over through Sandusky, Ohio, on over through Muncie, on over through Frankfort, and on over east of there into Illinois. So those two later on merged, and today you see the Norfolk Southern utilizing those. We also had the Central Indiana Railroad, came in from Anderson in 1899, lasted about 3 decades. Came from around Brazil, Indiana, hauled coal up here. Served Ball Brothers and some of the other industries in this town. Muncie and Western, with the Ball Corporation Railroad, only 5 miles long. Had a couple of locomotives. They had their own fleet of boxcars, bright yellow, and I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit, with called the Ball Line on it. Big canning jar on the doors of the car. We had the Cincinnati, Richmond, and Muncie became the Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, and then the Chesapeake and Ohio, and presently we all know that as the Cardinal Greenway. And many of you have ridden on that, and you'll see some shots on here that you might recognize. Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis, the Big Four. Became the New York Central, Penn Central, Conrail, and most of it here through Muncie is the CSX today. We had a connecting railway, the Belt Railroad of Muncie. It connected the Muncie and Western, C&O, LE&W, New York Central, and the Pennsylvania. It had about 3 miles of track. And it was established by some local business people here in town to tie all these roads together and serve the various industries around. Many of the railroads, as you see in that last line, the LE&W, the Lake Erie and Western. Anybody know what the comical name for that was?
Leave early and walk.
Leave early and walk. That's right. And then we had some others around town. We had the corned beef and cabbage. I don't really knew that. It was up north a little ways. And we had some other strange names on these railroads. First thing we'll look at here is the Citizen Street, the Union Traction, and the Indiana Railroad. Here's a picture of the fairground car, Citizen Street Railway. I could not find any pictures when the mules pulled those cars. Before they were electrified, and I believe was 600 volts DC, they were pulled by mules. This one went out wheeling and made a loop and came back on North Mulberry Street. And if you look on North Mulberry today, right east of the Walnut Street Bridge, you'll see the abutments in the river. They're still in the river. And a lot of this was torn out, especially during the 1913 floods. Another one of the Citizen Street Railway, and you can see on the side of the car there, again electrified. To the right of that car is Beech Grove Cemetery. That's before the old iron fence and the wall was put up. We still had the little picket fence around there. In the foreground here is Kilgore Avenue, still there today. Car barn. This was taken when the Citizen Street Railway, the car on the far right, and the Union Traction, the car on the left, shared much of the car barn there. Sort of a motley crew there in the foreground. That's along Perkins Avenue, and right behind where that Citizen Street car is would be Kilgore Avenue. Probably taken the same day, because I believe that's the same car sitting there in the foreground, the Citizen Street, looking the other way. That's looking sort of down Kilgore Avenue with the main line, which ran to Anderson, Indiana. Of course, ran through Yorktown, Daleville, Chesterfield, Anderson, and on to Indianapolis. The little cement building there in the foreground with the guy, it looks like he's got his thumb out to hitchhike, is a waiting shanty, and those were cast concrete. This picture was taken by, and many of you know him, Bill Spurgeon was here in town, a railroad entrance, and that's his car there in the foreground. And that was just prior to the old car barn being torn down along there. So Bill and I believe Dick Green was out there that day taking pictures. This gives you a little idea of where the car barn was. The car barn here is in the foreground, the large building right along Kilgore. Right to the right of it is a smaller building that faces up to Perkins, and then another building in the background. That building that faces up to Perkins is still there today. There it is. And many of you have driven by that and have seen it. It's, I believe, a warehouse of some kind. I believe there's a for sale sign on it today. But that building is still there. Then downtown, of course, we had the terminal. It's where people got on and off and debarked and so forth. Right to the left of that, at that point in time, was the First Baptist Church. And now we know where the First Baptist is, on down a little bit to the east and then on down to the north. There was 4 tracks that came into this building. On the right were some offices, and there was also a restaurant in there. And there's a fella that a few of us in this room knows, attends church with me. His name's Jack Richardson. Many of you know him. His mother used to bake homemade pies for that restaurant right there. And she was a great pie baker, let me tell you. But she baked the pies for that restaurant for years. If you look all the way through the car barn out into the back, you can't see much detail, but the next picture will show you what's out there. It's the old freight house for the Union Traction and the Indiana Railroad. And these tracks in the foreground coming through the brick and around to the left here would be going into the terminal, and those making a sharp exit to the right are going into the freight terminal there. That building a little later became Uptown Tire. And you can see that's when it was Uptown Tire. And today it's the YMCA. And that's what sits there today. Quite a change. Probably in about 1939, there was a fan trip. And this shows 3 cars along Kilgore Avenue. And now you can see there is a wall and a taller fence at Beech Grove Cemetery, as we probably see today over there. But that was along Kilgore Avenue during a fan trip. Some of you might recognize this out west of town. That's Yorktown, Indiana. The road still goes down there, makes a little turn to the left, across the bridge and turns right, except it's more lanes than it is now. There's a house over to the far right and a wall along the traction line tracks that is still there today, but that's where the traction line went and then across Buck Creek, right down there. Of course, one of the downfalls of the interurban was the advent of the bus. And after the Indiana Railroad went out of business in the traction, they formed a bus company. One of the things that put them out of business. And then we had the buses in Muncie. It was called the Indiana Railroad. And they were the same color as the cars were, orange and sort of a dark green or black. In the background is the Rose Court building. So that would be probably, what, Charles and Mulberry, if I remember right. Central Indiana. There's not a lot on Central Indiana, especially in the Muncie area. We can find quite a bit in Anderson and then further west, but not a lot in the Muncie area. This map, to show you a little bit where we are and to orient you, at the very top you can see the sign Memorial. That's Memorial Drive, 12th Street. Before that, some of you probably remember, it was called Omer, O-M-E-R Avenue. Right, the building in the far upper right corner is the new post office. And the railroad is running vertically right along the post office. You can see the line that sweeps over and comes around on an angle. That is where the Central Indiana Railroad was. The area, this here was White Feather Farms. The animal shelters here. The roundhouse sat here. A big machine shop repair facility sat here, and other things here. Came out here, switched back into these. This is Garkey Street. The area that took my picture, what I had my picture taken at Sandy Banks, was right in this area right here. This area was the hobo village called Sandy Banks area. This is a map, one of the insurance maps that showed the Central Indiana. That's the roundhouse, the turntable, some of the tracks, and the repair facilities and other tracks down here. I do have a VAL map that I don't have in this presentation that shows about 4 or 5 tracks coming out of this building. And that would lead me to believe that there could have been maybe a transfer table in here, because I didn't see any other tracks on the VAL maps that fed this facility. So I do not know how they got in there. I'm still looking for information on that. Again, a motley looking crew. That's the roundhouse at Central Indiana. And it's the only picture I have of Central Indiana roundhouse. I can remember it. I remember walking by it, but as a kid, you know, it's something that's always going to be there and you never take the picture of it. So I can remember it being there. The track in the foreground, well, let me lay a little bit of, this is Willard Street. This is Hoyt Avenue. The Norfolk Southern today comes around this real sharp bend right here. That was the Central Indiana Railroad. Sitting right about here was the freight house. It later became Huey Hoy's Tavern. Early on, before the nickel plate established a turntable at Kilgore, right over in this area was a turntable. No roundhouse, just a turntable for the nickel plate railroad. Shown on the maps, but I've never seen any pictures of that either. The building in the background was the Muncie Cap and Screw Company, and later became, I believe, a brewery. And into the far right, where these tracks went around and formed a Y, was Kirbywood Lumber. Westinghouse Electric was fed from the north end across 23rd Street by a portion of the Central Indiana Railroad. And those are the tracks. That's about the last time we used it to ship transformers out, and you can see why. We derailed this transformer. We actually just rolled the rails off of the ties at that point. They brought 7 locomotives out to pull it back on once they jacked it up, or tried to jack it up. 7 of them couldn't do it, so they brought 2 more out, and I'm not sure the 9 got it up. I think maybe they added another 1 or 2 to get it back up on the track. I remember standing along the side of that while the fellows they had dug holes down into the ground and put probably 18-inch square timbers down and put huge hydraulic jacks. They had a motor generator unit that drove the jacks and so forth. And the guy that was standing by the car kept telling the guy, okay, go ahead and jack it up. And the guy said, I am. He says, it's moving. I can see it. He says, I've moved it now about 6 inches. The guy says, you haven't moved it at all. Well, what they ended up doing was jacking the shoring down into the ground instead of a car going up. So they put more shoring in, and they finally got it up. And the tracks were laid on down under the wheels so that the locomotives could pull it up. That's how they got it up on there. It did not tip the transformer over. But that's the old Central Indiana tracks. Chicago, Indiana, and Eastern, the old Pennsylvania. Really the only pictures I can find of the terminal or the station, and that's on North Madison Street. If you look in the foreground, Madison comes up and it turns on Weiser and then becomes Martin Luther King or Broadway going that way. And as Madison went on down and then turned left, that's the Pennsylvania station. And that's, of course, the 1913 floods. And you can see the results of that there. This was a river right on north of that last picture. The bridge in the foreground is the Pennsylvania Bridge. It was a girder, through girder at that time, and the one in the background was a through girder for the C&O. And a question everybody always asks me, well, gee, did we have that much train traffic in town to have all those trains on those bridges when the floods came? The answer is no. The railroads always said, hey, let's put all those cars on there with stone or rock or whatever you could put in them. Let's put that weight on there to hold those pilings in the ground. Well, you can see it didn't work. And I've seen pictures all over the country where they do that. Some of them work and a lot of them don't work. So that's the results. That's why the cars are on the tracks. Later on, that girder bridge was replaced by a through truss bridge, through truss. That's North Madison on the right of that bridge. That's looking south. Way down at the end, you can see some cars. That'd be the Pennsylvania Yard. And as it swept around to the left, there would be the C&O and the C&O. Over to the left of this bridge, you can see another track. That's the C&O coming over there. And this is, if you would come back out toward the cameraman, that would be McCullough Park. That bridge is still there today. You can go out along McCullough Park and you can see it. That's looking south, but that's still the same bridge. We move out of Delaware County a little bit, but I wanted to show you that the Pennsylvania Railroad had some elaborate stations. This is the one in Matthews, Indiana. And behind it is the freight house, set on the west side of the main street of Matthews. Main Street would have run perpendicular to the tracks there in the foreground. And today, part of it's still there. Somebody's put a block front on this thing, but the back part of that building is the old station. It's been physically moved north about a block or so, but physically that is the same station, parts of it. Muncie and Western, 5 miles long, didn't have a lot of tracks, served mostly within the Ball Corporation. There's an early shot of one of their 70-ton General Electric diesels. That locomotive was purchased by Francis Parker in the architectural department here at school and was taken down to Whitewater Valley. And that's the locomotive was down there. At this time, it was painted very dark blue with, I believe, white writing on it. And the engineer in there at that time is not the person, but one of the early engineers on it, his name was Hoy Forthman. I had attended school with his son through all of my school years. Later on, that locomotive was painted light blue. That's at the south end of the Ball Corporation. There's the 70-tonner and the 45-ton GE. That's looking from 12th Street to the engine house, and I'm not certain that house isn't still there. I think it's been resited and changed quite a bit, but that was the initial engine house there.
Mid-cab engine up at Scheidler.
Yes, it is.
It's up at Scheidler.
Scheidler, and a fellow that used to work for me by the name of John Misiazik used to run that for him. But he's since moved to Oklahoma, so he doesn't do that anymore. But you're right. This was one of their cars. Bright yellow, had the ball jar, black background. The jar was sort of a silvery white color. Ball line was black. Of course, Ball wasn't the only company in town that had their own cars. Marhofer had cars. There happens to be a stock car. They also had refrigerator cars. I do not have a picture of a refrigerator car. That one we happened to get out in Omaha, Nebraska. It was taken out there. I assume they were probably hauling cattle from there to maybe back here or someplace. But I believe there are two cars. I can't quite tell, but I believe the car, you can just see the end of it, is also a Marhofer car. Of course, those from Westinghouse recognize this one. That's east side of the Westinghouse plant. That's called a Schnabel car. Initially designed in Germany. It was made by the McDowell-Wellman Company in Cleveland, Ohio. That happens to be a 12-axle car. That was the smallest of the Schnabel cars. And what a snobble car does at the very bottom, in these areas here, there are large pins, maybe this big around. And these pins, this transformer is hanging up on cable by a crane. The cars are apart, and these ends are tipped back a bit like this. Transformer's lowered down, they put the big pins in, then they take the weight off the crane, and as the weight of the crane comes off, the ends of this car pushes in against big bumper blocks up here, and this becomes a... After the transformer has been delivered, this thing here with the opening in it goes down and hooks over both ends, and the car comes back with no transformer in it. So that's what a transformer. The reason for that car is you can see how low to the ground you can get that transformer, so that you can get clearance through bridges, through tunnels, through whatever. We had two bigger cars than that, the 201 and the 203 car. Those were 16-axle cars. Carried a bigger transformer, heavier loads, same principle. Transformer was dropped down, pins put in, the ends came in, and the moved to its destination. That transformer, while in transit, could be moved sideways, back and forth, and it could be moved up and down. The reason for that, as a train would go around a radius, that car is so long that it would hang out on the inside of that radius. Well, if you hang that car out too far, it'll roll over on you. So as it was in transit, we had a crew that would go with it. They would jack that thing over so that it wouldn't be hanging out as far and wouldn't have a chance of tipping over.
Are those cars still in use today?
They are, and I believe they're located in they're in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, I believe. Another company purchased those, and they still utilize those cars to haul transformers. Yeah. Okay. The question there was, are those cars still in existence? And the answer is yes, they are. They're in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And a private company owns them, and they still use them to haul transformers for the utilities in the United States. General Electric also has 2 or 3 cars. They're a little bit different design because General Electric made core form transformers. These are called shell form transformers. When Westinghouse bought out the large power core form division at Pittsfield, Massachusetts, we also obtained the General Electric cars. I do not have any of those pictures in this presentation. The 202 car, this car would carry 1 million pounds, and it has 20 axles. Same principles as the other, but it's just a larger car. And you can see how long that thing is. And you talk about hanging out over a curve, it can really hang out. And those were limited to speed. They had to switch them with an engine attached to them, supposedly. But sometimes it got switched without an engine attached to it, and it was derailed or damaged. But you get the weight of that, you may have a transformer 400 or 500 ton there on a car, and when that thing gets to rolling, let me tell you, it's hard to stop it. Tell you a little story on that. This car was being built at McDowell Wellman in Cleveland, and they have a test track. It's on an incline. And this track goes down, and they test the brakes on these cars. And at the end of this track, it goes down a hill, and then it levels out. And at the end of that level track, there's just like these things that used to stop trucks, full of pea gravel that they run out. So they ran this thing down there, and they locked up the brakes on it. Tracks, and it buried that thing in the pea gravel. Now you can imagine trying to get that thing back on the tracks. So what they said after that is 20 axles are not going to stop this thing. So we always had to have what we called idler cars. It's always traveled with idler cars, flat cars with loads on it on either side of it, plus of course the caboose where the crew rode. And those idler cars would usually have radiators or coolers or various other components that would mount on that transformer. And that got more wheels on the track to help stop it. And I'm not sure you could have stopped it then, but still, that's the idea. Along with the Norfolk or the Muncie and Western, I mentioned a while ago we had the Muncie Beltway. And the track to the left there would be the Muncie Beltway. The track on the right would be the Nickel Plate, or the Norfolk Southern. That building in the background is the infamous building that many of us have read about in the papers here recently, the old Muncie Lawnmower Building that they want to tear down, or somebody doesn't want to tear down, or the whatever. And that's where that's located. That's just east of Madison. On the right of those tracks used to be the old Republic Iron and Steel Company. And I think in the Ball State collection, the Auto Sellers and Swift collections, there's pictures of the Republic Iron and Steel. It would be just this side of that. Also, when the circus came to town, these tracks that went on east over toward Hackley Street, many times the circus unloaded over there, as well as downtown between Council and Liberty Street, and sometimes back of the ball plant. Cincinnati, Richmond, and Muncie became the Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, Chesapeake, and Ohio, and it's now the Cardinal Greenway. So there was an early picture of that station. It looks very similar to what you see out there today, except the mode of transportation is a bit different. Don't see anything motorized there. Maybe there is in the background, but most of it's horse-drawn. The building in the back behind the boxcar that says Wabash is the freight house. And now we'll look at the back side of that. Probably, I took that, I believe, in the 70s. I believe early 70s. To the far right, you can just see the corner of the station over there. The track in the very foreground is the Cardinal Greenway. That's where you would ride a bicycle and walk today. The track next to it that switches into that does not switch into it anymore, but it's where the Norfolk Southern runs. It runs around those same tracks. The freight house you can see in the background. The water tower and the smokestacks are probably to the producer's dairy. And this building with the ramp and the tracks going up in the air is the Virginia Oil and Coal. And you say, well, how'd they get those cars up there? Well, at the other end of that building was a winch house, and it actually pulled those cars up by cable. The one track that you see that car setting on is from the C&O. The next track over would have switched in from the Nickel Plate, and they both could serve the Virginia Coal. So there's what the winch house looked like. That's some motors up there, and if you notice the construction, it's all wood, no steel in those days. May have been some corrugated steel on the building in places, but all the structural part was all big, heavy, creosoted wood. In the background, you still see the front edge of the Virginia Oil and Coal with a ramp going down. And in the foreground, you see some crew cars. So Muncie did have occasionally the C&O and the Nickel Plate and the New York Central had crews in town working on railroads that would stay in various places in their crew cars. In the foreground there is one of the old steam engine tenders. And probably used to haul or to store fuel oil or water in, probably fuel oil. Those that have ridden out to the south end of the reservoir, you can see the bridge that goes into Mount Pleasant to the right there over the Cardinal Greenway, but that's when the tracks were still there. That was probably shortly before the tracks were torn out. North of town, and you do not see any traces of this anymore. This is a tower called Drew, D-R-E-W Tower. In the foreground where these rods are, just to the left of that is the C&O. And to the tracks going beyond the tower that way is the Pennsylvania, going to Anthony, Stockport, Matthews. This was a tower called Drew Tower that was located at that interchange. I believe at one time there were some interchange tracks here, but I do not have pictures of that. I'm not certain of the date that picture was taken. It came from Jeff Keeler with C&O Historical Society, that picture did. Jeff did not have a date on it. C&O had some problems occasionally. You can see there's the the wreck out toward Gaston, cleaning it up. About that same time, there was also a wreck over Losantville. Losantville had a Y, and all the big heavy locomotives from Cincinnati up through the hilly country would usually drop off the trains at Losantville, turn around and go back, and the other locomotives that were smaller would take them on north from there because the track was more level. But that happens to be some diesels that in the 70s that had run off the track. Norfolk Southern, nickel plate. They had a coaling tower called an Ogle coaling tower. This is where that picture was taken. You can see the roundhouse there to the right, the water tower in the foreground, and just to the left of that water tower, that white section, that's a part of the turntable. And in the background would be Delco Battery, Chevrolet Muncie. And then the tracks over along there would be the New York Central. There's what the Ogle coaling tower looked like. There was a company that built these, and they went to many different railroads and located all across the country. And Muncie happened to have one of them. That is in Muncie there. Some of you remember a guy by the name of Jake Schroyer. He used to be a heavy equipment and dug things and tore things up and etc. He brought a locomotive in from the Gatex Car Company in Greenville, Pennsylvania. And it was an 060T, which meant it's the tank engine. It carried its own water around its boiler. And Jake brought it in. He put it on the nickel plate turntable, which was still there. The roundhouse and everything else was gone, but the turntable was still there. So Jake put that on there, and they took his bulldozer and dug a pit at one end of it and backed his truck down in there, put rail on it, pulled that engine up on his truck. That's how he took it out to his place. This, some of you recognize from, I think, the nickel plate book. That's a locomotive coming across the bridge at McCullough Park on the nickel plate. I don't know how many in this room might remember that. That's right down the middle of Madison Street. The street crossing perpendicular to the tracks there is Main Street. Church in the background is Jackson Street Church steeple. And the cornerstone for the arts is sitting right over here to the left. That was a picture that of the nickel plate when it was still down Madison. And the cars on this side ran this way, and the other side, of course, ran that way on the street while the train was running down the middle. When you got down at the south end of it, you had a problem, though, because that track cut across Madison this way. Something that's long gone, two things in that picture you don't see anymore. One is the guy with a stop sign that was a crossing guard, and the other thing in the background is a caboose on that train. You don't see many of those anymore. That's one of the nickel plate locomotives, 765. It's a Berkshire, which meant the wheel arrangement. It had two pilot trucks, 8 drivers, and 4 trailing trucks under the boiler. That's an excursion that was here in town, and they had stopped to take on passengers or drop off passengers. I don't remember which on this shot. There it is down toward Springport after it left, heading toward Newcastle. There's sort of a valley there that's coming down the hill and out, which made a fairly decent shot. Then we go into the New York Central. That's the station many of you remember prior to it being torn down. On this side was the Big Four, the New York Central. On the far side was the nickel plate. And it served both railroads. There it was a little later, a little worse for repair. Looks like the roof was needing some work on it. Pardon? I'm not certain of the date right off the top of my head.
Mid-80s, I think.
Early 90s, late 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, I believe, but I don't remember. At a busier time, of course, that terminal, and that's on the New York Central, we had, that happens to be a Baldwin locomotive. I think they call them baby faces, is that right, Mont? they call them. I think the second unit might be a GE. I can't really tell, but it's a pretty good sized train it's hauling through here. That's the inside of the station. On the right side was the nickel plate, and on the left side here was the Big Four. One thing I can remember about that, when you walked in there, it echoed. That's the only thing I can remember about it. It was a very hollow, echoing sound when you walked in there, all wood and all concrete. It was quite loud. New York Central Freight House, that building's still there today. That was taken a little earlier time, as you can see by the vehicles. I think Lee's Supply, Plumbing Supply or something was there at one time, but that building is still there. Dick Green, that took pictures for the newspapers. My mother was a librarian at the Muncie newspaper, so anytime a train picture came in, she would try to get an extra copy. Well, Dick Green didn't have an extra copy of this one, so he set his camera up and took a picture of a picture, and that's what that is. But in the background is the New York Central and Nickel Plate Station. There's a road locomotive here in the foreground and a switching locomotive on the left. On the east side of Muncie, we had the Vance Tower. We had the Pennsylvania crossing coming across here, the Nickel Plate, and then across the Big Four. There was a street on down there called Lincoln Street, and this was just a control tower for the railroad. Never knew what you were going to see. Downtown one day, there were 4 cars sitting there from the Alaska Railroad. And if you know anything about railroading, you know there are no tracks in this country, in the lower 48, that connect with Alaska. The only way to get there is to go up to either Vancouver or another town or two, put them on a barge and take them to Alaska and download them at Seward or one of those towns. So these cars had been to Chevrolet Muncie, and they brought them uptown after they had emptied them. What was in them, I do not know, but they were empty at this time, and they were there a couple days, and then they were gone. So whether they were taken to be scrapped, I have no idea after that, but it was Alaska Railroad. Probably remember this guy here, came through town in the early 50s. This does not happen to be a shot here in town. And the reason, I can't find the picture that I have of him when he was speaking. Someplace I've misplaced it. But Harry Truman, his daughter, his wife. That car is called the Ferdinand Magellan. That car is still in existence. And that's where a lot of the presidents spoke. I can remember when that train came into town, and I want to say it was 51, 52. They let Muncie Central out. And all the kids ran down. The band went down. They set up. They said, "Where's the car going to stop?" And they said, "Right here." Band set up, and everybody was ready to play. All of a sudden, the train comes in. Engineer misses where you're going to drop the car off. Now, if you can imagine these guys with these great big horns running down the tracks to the new location to play for Truman, that's what happened.
Larry, I think he came through in 48, that's when he was campaigning for election.
I think he was campaigning for somebody else at this time in the 50s. He was campaigning in the 40s, but in the 50s, I believe he was campaigning for, would it be Stevenson? Adlai Stevenson, I believe.
He was running against Eisenhower.
I believe that's correct.
That was 52.
It was 52 then. I don't know. Shirley, you were in the band. Did you have to run down the tracks?
I ran down the track.
I can remember that. They had their share of problems too. This was west of Muncie, and this happened in about 51. Happened on a Sunday morning about 6 a.m. And the reason I remember that, I was a newspaper carrier. My dad always helped me on Sundays. And we were carrying the papers, and all of a sudden all kinds of sirens. I think everyone in Muncie started heading down 12th Street and all the streets heading out west. So my dad, he liked to be in on the action, so he said, "Let's jump in the car." We were through carrying papers, and he says, "Let's go see what happened." So I grabbed the camera, and we ran out down to, I don't know whether that's Purdue Road or what it is there, about where the orchard was. And right west of there, between there and Warner Gear, was back of Ernst Nursery, was about where this wreck was. Well, unlike today, when we got there, of course, being Sunday morning at 6 a.m., there wasn't a lot of people there yet other than police and firemen and ambulance and whatever. So as soon as we got there, a couple of police pointed to my dad and I and says, we're going to need all the help we can, you guys. You guys, there was 4, my dad and I and 2 other guys, says, you guys take this car and you go in there and help the people out. And I thought, what have I gotten into here? You know, I could see people all really mangled. Well, I think the worst thing we had in the car we went in was a lady had a broken wrist. I think everybody else, they were cut up a little bit or had abrasions on them and so forth, but that was about the worst. And I think somebody had broken a leg or 2 in another car, but that was about it. But there was 5 or 6 of the cars had derailed there. They had just left Muncie and was just getting up to speed. And they, I think there was a switch going to Warner Gear and kabang, off they went.
When was that?
That must have been 50 or 51, 1950 or 51. Of course, on the east side of town, crossing White River, they had a derailment. This was been late 60s, 70s. And I believe those cars were carrying bauxite, if I remember at the time. Because you can see the white all along the rail, and it was dumped in the river. And I have some other pictures that shows it dumped in the river. I believe that's Broderick's there to the left. I show the Selma station. The reason I show that because my wife's here, and her dad used to pick up the mail there. She used to go with him to pick up the mail when they tossed it off the train. So that happens to be the elevator in the background and the Selma station. There were other stations too. The Nickel Plate had one at DeSoto, and there were various other stations around also of the small towns. This is sort of an overall picture winding down toward the end here. This happens to be Walnut Street. Looking north, you can see the courthouse and the stacks from power generation plant. That big building back of the Pure Oil sign was a New Southern Hotel. That's Victor Street back there. If you look here on the right, you'll see the T&H sweeper that's still there. I believe the building in the foreground is Ball State's building. In the background is the Nickel Plate. The middle 2 tracks are the Big 4. And this track is the Nickel Plate coming in from the south. It crosses the Big 4 and ties into the Nickel Plate on the other side. The filling station was a Kerr-McGee filling station. And the big thing I remember about that, during the Second World War, we always bought black market gas there. We never had to have gas stamps. So we had a T stamp, so we had all the gas we ever needed. You could buy at the Kerr-McGee station. Now today, the Hooker Glass. That used to be the A&P market. Used to be there. Where that Kerr-McGee station is, I'll show you an earlier shot in this next one. That's what used to sit there. There was a little bar in the corner and a hauled freight with trucks, in this case wagons, out of there. The New Southern Hotel's in the background. Walnut Street with the trolley tracks in the foreground. And today, there's what we have. 2 locomotives take up almost the whole bridge going across the White River at McCullough Park. I'm not certain what those locomotives are. I probably have it written down somewhere. Maybe 4,400 horsepower jobs, probably 6,000s maybe. But if you stop and think about it, those things can haul 100 cars easy. Each car might have 2 semi-trailers on it. So you can figure out there might be 200 trucks on that train pulled by 8,800 horsepower, which you figure out that's about 44 horsepower per trailer. You sure can't do that, can you, Mon, on the road?
It takes about 300.
That's right.
I live a quarter of a mile off of Norfolk and Southern, and I counted 160 cars behind the
Certainly.
train.
So that's less than 44 horsepower per train. Okay, that's sort of a snapshot of what Muncie was and bringing up to date. I didn't do a lot with the modern stuff because I think we can see that almost every day. So are there any questions?
Do you have any pictures of the pickup of the mail when they're hanging up bags and drop it off and things like that?
Yeah, that's what she did, but I do not have pictures. He was asking a question if I have any pictures of where they used to pick up the mail. And the previous question, he was saying that he had lived near the Norfolk Southern and sees some trains with 160 cars on, not just 100. Any other questions?
Not a
Sure.
question, but at 12th Street, Memorial Drive and the railroad track on the north side, my dad's grocery was there at Wilson's Market, sat there on the corner of the track, and he fed the hobos and he fed the crews. They would come in the grocery and he had a room in the back, and they would sit on the bags of potatoes and whatever. Dad fixed them bologna sandwiches.
Shirley was saying that her father owned a store right on the north side of 12th Street there by the tracks and fed the hobos. And my grandparents lived the other side, on the south side, about 4 or 5 houses from the tracks, and many times I've eaten lunch with them. Not a problem. And you know, you heard about, well, I came from Oklahoma and I've been to California, there's no work, and I did this. And my grandmother would always say, I'll feed you, but you got to work. They'd either sweep the porch, rake the side yard, sweep the back wall. Then she'd give them a chair like you're sitting on with the back broken off with a washpan on it, a little teeny mirror that I still have at home, and an old straight razor my grandfather had, soap, a towel, and a washcloth. And she says, when you get cleaned up, you can come in and eat with us. And they would always clean up. They would always come in and eat. And she would always pack them 3 or 4 sandwiches to take with them. Never would give them money, but she would always pack sandwiches for them. And there was a mark on the front of their house, and I'm not sure to this day, and I never took a picture of what it was, but there was a mark of some kind on their house. Yes,
We had
Jack.
that in the 30s down Madison Street because we had 4 highways going down there, 67, 35, 21, and 3, all on Madison Street. And they stopped in, they would come to the back door. Mother would never let them come in, but she would fix the food, take it out to them.
Right,
But that was families many times, it wasn't hobos, it was families.
right. Times have changed. Maybe we're getting back there. Who knows? Yes.
My father was born in 1909, and he used to tell stories when I was a kid. When he was a kid, the train would slow down to come into Muncie, and they would take like a wagon and go out the edge of town and jump on a coal car and fill coal off. They put the coal in the wagon and they would sell it when they were kids. And there was, I guess, railroad detectives. When did they phase those guys out?
They're probably still around. He was saying that his father remembers when they used to jump on the trains and throw coal off. My father relates the same story. They would take, in those days they called them gunny sacks, and he would take them down. He said a lot of times the train crew would help throw it off. He said they did not have to get on, but the train crew, and it was usually on the C&O that was hauling coal from West Virginia to Chicago. Any other questions?
Well, I had a comment. When Indiana Still Water was still open, right when they were getting ready to close, I got brought in. I was working security, and there were still hobos running around at that point that I'd find in the building trying to stay warm and stuff, where they were hitching a ride on the train, and every once in a while, talk to one of them. Well, I'm just on my way out to California to try and get a job, or and you see stuff like that, and then out there at Red Gold, you'd see them jumping out of the cars just before they'd be pulled into Red Gold,
Right.
too.
Yeah, used to be a good mode of transportation. If any of you ever happens to see it, there's a movie called The Emperor of the North. If anybody has an opportunity and you like railroads, see that film. You'll enjoy it. It's about the SP&S, the Seattle, Spokane, and Portland, Spokane. And it's about hobos and the dealings with the railroad detectives and so forth. Yes?
Question and then a comment, if I could, please. Is it true that circa 1946, after World War II, GM and some of the other car companies were complicit in the tearing up of the interurban tracks? Do you know anything about that?
Well, I think you always hear stories about, of course, GM and big industries were coming out with buses at about that same time. And of course, they were promoting buses, and the rubber companies were promoting tires. So, you know, you put the two together, and maybe that was the demise of the railroad.
Yeah.
And probably, had the interurban survived, maybe until 1941, 42, 43, we may still have rapid transit in this country. I don't know.
Well, that's my next comment. I don't know if anybody reads the paper, the Sunday's Star Press, February 15th. there's an article about the Muncie, Muncie, Indianapolis commuter rail feasibility. The commission found that there's feasibility for a line running roughly from Bloomington to here, and then also Northwest Indiana. The meeting's a week from Swenson.
Be great.
Kennedy Library.
It'd be great.
Yeah.
Probably running out of time, John. I'd let you. Yes.
My mother-in-law lived near that wreck that you're talking about near Gaston.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the cars was full of Hershey's chocolate glass. And they had chocolate for almost a year until
Yes.
Let me just ask you, are you familiar with the early history of the railroads, their origins? Were they land grants by the government to construct the lines? How much land were they given?
Not all that familiar. A little bit, but not all that familiar. I'm a railroad buff, and I grew up and was born and raised here. And I'm also a model railroader, but believe it or not, what I model is way up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I model the Lake Superior and Ishpeming, the Quincy and Torch Lake narrow gauge, and the DSS&A, which is the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic. And I would be a little bit familiar with land grants and things up there and all the inner workings, but not necessarily here.
Larry, when I was young, I lived at Falk Avenue and 12th Street. There was a railroad just on the other side of our driveway. Pennsylvania, that's what
Yes,
it
it
was.
is.
I was young enough, I didn't know what it was. I used to put pennies on the track and smash my
Yeah, I still have some of those oval pennies. Some of them you can still see the outline of Lincoln on them even.
That wasn't a local track then. It went behind the wire mill and down to Virginia Coal and Oil. And
Yeah.
it served both of those. I didn't know if that was local or...
Yeah, there are some things in town. The track that used to go into the power plant at Weiser and Walnut Street, of all names, it was called the Jerusalem Spur. Why it was called that, I have no idea. But it was called the Jerusalem Spur. Jim?
Yeah, Larry, I have one question. There's a set of tracks still embedded out here on a street just south of University. Is it either Dix or?
Calvert is where it's at.
Calvert Street.
Calvert.
Was that for like an interurban?
Street railway in there.
It's like a block long.
Yeah.
I'm glad they left them there, but is there any more around Muncie, you know, like that?
There used to be some down University right in front of the ad building.
I mean, still.
I think there may be some on North Street, but I may be wrong.
Just to follow, is there any way to find out how much of the track is buried underneath the street, particularly inside Muncie?
I suppose a metal detector would be the only way I would know. Yeah.
Nobody has the plans for covering the track.
There is at the courthouse, and I believe it's the GIS, does that sound right? GIS has the Sanborn insurance maps, and they also have what's called the value maps. They're they call them VAL maps of all the railroads and where they were located. So you might want to look at, I have most of the VAL maps myself, copies of. So
We have the Sanborn maps here, and we digitized a lot of them, and you'll find them on the web also for the early years.
If you like railroad pictures and pictures of Muncie and Delaware County old, if you go on John's website and look at the auto sellers, the W.A. Swift, and the Spurgeon Green pictures, there's a wealth of railroad pictures in there. Some of these would be from those files. Okay.
Well, thank you, Larry.
I'm going to be around for a few minutes if you want to talk to him, ask him any questions. So thank you all for coming, and if you get stopped by on the train on the way home, just enjoy it.